When inflation started to accelerate in early 2022, then Chancellor Rishi Sunak couldn't wait to attribute the rise to global factors. Now it's coming down, he's claiming that as a success for government policy. The problem for the Prime Minister is that by now even Larry the Cat knows the job of cutting inflation is for the Bank of England. So any suggestion the government is responsible for it falling just insults the public's intelligence. So scrambling about for at least one thing the government can say it's actually done to bring inflation down, up pops Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride with this gem.
Yeah, when it was at 11%, you guys were queuing up to tell me that it was nothing to do with you lot.
So it's a combination of things. When you get an external shock, a sudden shock to the economy from a war in Europe and a sudden spike in energy prices.
So sometimes it's got something to do with you and sometimes it hasn't.
No, it's a mixture. I mean, the honest truth is that it's a mixture. So if you have a sudden price shock, all economies around the world experienced a surge of inflation and they had no control over that at all. But what we do have control over, as I say, is, for example, controlling public spending, controlling public sector pay increases so that we help alongside the Bank of England to bring inflation down, and I think we've been very successful in doing that.
The Work and Pensions Secretary couldn't contain his excitement as he rushed across to BBC One to repeat the claim.
And it's the Bank of England who control the interest rates who've got it there, isn't it? Not the government.
It's a combination of both. So, of course, monetary policy is the preserve of the Bank of England, but equally you have to have accommodative fiscal policy in order to work in the same direction in getting inflation down. So that means controlling spending. And it means, for example, taking the tough choices around high wage demands and making sure that you don't basically give in to high wage demands and thereby fuel inflation that way. So the government had a key role in getting inflation down.
The claim is, of course, complete bollocks. Let's just sit on a shelf for a moment that pay packets are now worth less than they were in 2008 in nearly 2/3 of UK local authorities, that millions of workers are currently enduring the longest pay squeeze in more than 200 years, that not since Napoleonic times has there been such a sustained period of wage stagnation, and that according to the International Monetary Fund, it was rising corporate profits which were the largest contributor to Europe's inflation, as companies increased prices by more than the spike in costs of imported energy. When the Work and Pensions Secretary says this,
what we do have control over, as I say, is, for example, controlling public spending, controlling public sector pay increases.
He must surely know what he's saying is complete economic illiteracy. This isn't rocket science. If a private sector company increases its wages, yes, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service, and that might end up increasing the price. But that's not the case with public sector workers such as education and healthcare, which are free at the point of use. That means consumers do not pay for them directly, and so they do not affect the inflation statistics. And this isn't the first time the government has shamelessly used this sham argument.
Look, the most important thing we can do to help people is to control inflation. We've got to reduce inflation. That's what's making life difficult for nurses and for everyone else in the country. And a big part of how we are going to grip and reduce inflation is by having restraint when it comes to pay settlements.
Strike action is holding back growth. It's also leading to cancelled operations and school closures. When will you resolve these disputes?
We want to resolve the public sector strikes as quickly as we can. We're prepared to be completely reasonable. We will talk about anything except measures that will entrench high inflation.
So, one of the factors that we have to consider, particularly at a time of high inflation, is if we do inflation matching pay rises, that can actually drive inflation further.
We want to be as reasonable as possible. Steve Barclay and other ministers have been meeting with union representatives to talk to them, to see if there are ways forward, to discuss next year's pay settlement and set out our arguments on affordability there. But I think what you see with inflation today means that if the international factors are beginning tentatively to work in the right direction, the worst thing that we could do domestically would be to significantly increase public sector pay and then entrench inflation in the British economy.
It's an argument that's been completely rubbished over and over again by expert economists. And don't just take my word for it. Listen to Stephanie Flanders, an expert economist speaking to BBC's Laura Kunsberg.
They're concerned that inflation, which we know is putting so much pressure on people, will be bumped further up if they hand over lots more money to the public sector. As a very expert economist, does that stack up?
It is not something that economists tend to agree with, I'm sorry, because if it is very different. If you have a private sector company increase its wages, well, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service and may well then end up meaning they have to increase the price in the shops. Obviously, that's not the case with public sector workers. There isn't a price that's going to go up. Of course, there's a bill to be paid, and one always would have to ask questions about where the money's going to come from. Is it going to squeeze other things in the health? If it's going to increase health spending, which would mean it was additional, obviously there is an additional demand on the economy which could potentially increase inflation at the margins. But I think this equivalence, people understand that if a private sector company raises wages, that's going to add to costs and to prices. It just isn't the same thing for public sector workers. And when you've had the kind of gap that's opened up since 2010 between public and private sector workers in terms of their pay, even with the difference of conditions and other things, that is in itself an issue in terms of morale and in terms of the sort of stability of the system.
We literally can't believe a word this government says on anything.